coming up in. So my philosophy is I've been a member of the T&I committee is really to work with my state and local governments, the business community, and other organizations with an interest in transportation funding here in the 2nd District to make sure that the priorities that my district has, which of course are also across Minnesota, are included from a language perspective in this bill. So, for example, active projects like the Dakota County Veterans Memorial Greenway, which has a grant program called the Active Transportation Connectivity Grant Program that a project like that would qualify for. Included in this bill, and I should back up and just say that the surface transportation bill that we are going to be marking up is a 46% increase over the last bill that the Congress passed, the House passed. So I'm optimistic that we're going to get a decent bill here. It's a $494 billion bill over 5 years that would make that really transformative investments in surface transportation and rail transportation. Again, a 46% increase. I will just tell you that the Senate America's Transportation Infrastructure Act of 2019, so the Senate bill, would authorize $287 billion over 5 years. So the Senate had a $287 billion bill. The House has a $494 billion bill. My suspicion is that the funding levels will be somewhere in the middle if that goes to conference committee. So I'm optimistic, and I've decided that I'm going to remain optimistic, even though over the course of the last year and a half, there's been moments where we thought we were going to get a very large infrastructure bill. The president was talking about $2 trillion. We've talked about $1 trillion previously, and sadly, politics have potentially gotten in the way of some of that. But I'm going to continue to remain optimistic because I've said to my House leadership, if the president wants to do an infrastructure bill, that we should do an infrastructure bill. So my suspicion is by October, we should have some, I suspect we'll pass this infrastructure bill. I don't know what the final form will look like because of the 200+ amendments we're expecting here to go through tomorrow. But I expect that by October, we will get a surface transportation bill to the president and hopefully signed into law. And I think the politics of this probably favor it, if anything here. The president's going to want to be able to talk about providing for infrastructure, transportation funding as well. And at the end of the day, I very much view this level of investment as, really critical to the economic stimulus that is going to be required as we come out of the public health crisis that we currently find ourselves in. No matter where the unemployment rate currently is, whether it's 13.3% or 16 point something percent, it's still a very high unemployment rate. We're hearing from the trades that a number of projects are in limbo. Obviously, the pressure that our state budget is put under, our local and county budgets are put under, also play a significant role in this. And at least from a surface transportation funding perspective in the House, in the first year of our bill in the House, no federal matching grant, no federal matching dollars would be required. So that's something that is on our mind, is just the fact that our states are going to be coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic in fairly dire straits. So with that, Margaret, I will stop talking and more than anything, just give you guys a chance to ask some questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And again, for everybody who's participating, Please submit your questions in the little bubble that you see at the top of the screen next to the little people at the top. That's the chat box, and you can just type in your question there. I had a couple questions. One, the first one I guess I'll start with has to do with the light rail project, the Blue Line extension in the Northwest metro area. They're formerly, I believe, known as Botno, but there's been a lot of discussion about that project for many years, and I guess the concern is whether or not Burlington Northern Rail will negotiate and work with the local governments and the state on building that project, and if there's anything that can be done at the federal level to help push that project along.
Let me start with Southwest Light Rail update. I did have an opportunity, you know, as my caucus's only Democratic TNI member to get an update from, or to seek an update, let me put it that way, from Adam Sullivan, who's the Assistant Secretary for Governmental Affairs at USDOT last week. And, you know, I made him aware of the funding agreement still pending before that expiration letter of no prejudice on June 30th. I know that, you know, I made sure that he knows what an important project this is for transit and jobs in the metro region overall into the state of Minnesota. And he, from last week, noted that he would be in communication with FTA about the project. So I'm still waiting on an update from Mr. Sullivan on the update that I've requested. But you know, I'm certainly willing, again, as sort of the Democratic caucus leader on TNI, to continue to push USDOT on that project. So I wish I had a better update from USDOT for you, but I wanted you to know that I requested a meeting with Secretary Chow on this topic and was able to get a meeting with the Assistant Secretary last week. In terms of the Blue Line extension, I mean, look, it's unfortunate. I know that our communities have spent a ton of money already on this project, and you know, I'm ready to assist in any way as the state's TNI member on pushing on this project. So if there is a plan that you guys would like my team to work with you on in terms of putting together a strategy for me to do any outreach or pushing on this, I certainly stand ready. I don't want the state of Minnesota, anywhere in the state of Minnesota, to miss out on significant projects, particularly right now, that will help us put people to work. So if there's any role I can play on that, I'm certainly happy to push.
Great. Well, thank you. I know the city of Golden Valley had asked that question, and so they're particularly anxious, I think, about that project.
Yep.
Another question that we have, how do you see the breakdown between transit and highways and that discussion going? I know in the Senate, they've only passed the highway title or put together a highway title.
Yeah.
So do you see any issues in terms of that? And how do you see this helping more rural states or impacting more rural states with the kind of division of the funding?
Yeah. So, you know, as I look through the bill, you know, at the various pots of money here, I mean, this is, if you look at my congressional district, this is something that you know, if I'm going to represent this whole community, I have to keep in mind. So I've really tried to push for dollars for our rural communities as well as, you know, transit. You know, what's interesting about my district is, you know, I've got suburban, exurban, and rural communities, and so we've got transit needs. You know, a rapid bus lane on on Interstate 35 as you turn through Lakeville, and the need for an extra lane there. So the bill actually has $49 billion in it over 5 years for local transportation funding. It's got about $600 million per year through the Community Transportation Grant Program for projects that improve public safety, with a minimum of 25% of those funds set aside for rural communities. So we've tried to really press in each of these categories, those of us who represent rural parts of the country, to make sure that there's some sort of carve out here for rural communities. There's a Rebuild Rural Grant Program in the bill focused on infrastructure in rural communities. And then there's something called the Expand the High Risk Rural Roads Program and increase safety investments for rural roads. So, you know, I am, by the way, there's also a standalone bridge repair program in the bill. So, you know, this is something that, you know, I've been particularly focused on as you look at where a lot of these federal dollars typically go, where they start in Washington and they end up having a little bit more of a balance to where that funding goes. So, you know, it's something that is on my mind as I look at, you know, how do I make sure that I'm representing my entire district, not just the suburban parts of my district.
Great. Another question that we're always concerned about is the status of the Highway Trust Fund. And I know there was just a recent report about the decline in federal gas tax revenue going into the Highway Trust Fund with all of the stay-at-home orders that have been issued around the country. And while we understand that the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee doesn't deal with the taxes or the funding piece of this, have you heard anything more about how the bill would be paid for? And can you talk a little bit about the vehicle miles traveled pilot that is in the bill?
Yeah, I think in the long term, we all realize that VMT is going to be something that we have to consider moving forward with. But, you know, certainly this is not ready for prime time as a specific and you know, central part of funding for highway transportation. You know, the truth is, I don't know where this conversation is going to go. We all know that this conversation has been a critically important one, and that, you know, I've certainly supported the Chamber of Commerce recommendation that we add 5 cents to the federal gas tax over 5 years. That particularly seems reasonable as our energy gas costs have declined such. And so, you know, it's challenging, to be honest with you, around the gas tax, because a number of my colleagues have signed off on pledges that really are just, you know, this or that. You know, there's no middle ground in this. So I think longer term, a more fair system likely is VMT, but we're gonna, you know, we're not ready for prime time. And so I think these pilots will give us critical information. But it's a real concern with, you know, folks traveling less, so with the stay-at-home orders and the revenue decline. And, you know, I think, you know, we're right now, there's just, you know, as I think about a transportation and infrastructure bill or a bonding bill here, even at the state level, there is no better time to invest in rebuilding America's highways and roads and bridges. You know, interest rates are at virtually 0%. You know, and these are, I've said throughout the COVID-19 public health crisis, at the state and at the federal level, you know, there are a bunch of bad policy choices, right? So, you know, none of us would want to be going through what we're going through as a nation and as a world, but we are. And so, you know, if America's willing to make the right policy choices, we can keep ourselves out of a depression. We can pull ourselves over time out of a recession. And I personally believe part of the good public policy of pulling ourselves out of this recession is going to be a doubling down of investment in infrastructure. So I wish I could be more optimistic about, you know, something like the gas tax, the federal gas tax, but I learned early on that that seems to be a non-starter. But I think the conversation is ongoing, and that the public health crisis only really accelerates the need to invest in our communities and making sure that we invest in all of our communities.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that. We know that is always the big challenge with these kinds of bills, but I think it's really important that this House bill is as big as it is, because it really acknowledges and recognizes the level of the problem that's out there. So we really appreciate that, the fact that it is a pretty big bill compared to the FAST Act. Another.
Well, it is. It's not what we were hoping for. I mean, you'll know that we put forward about a $1 trillion proposal a little bit earlier here in this session, but certainly it's something that we think will be closer in conference to becoming law after we have a good public policy debate about what's in and what's out.
Right. One area that is also of a lot of interest to our members is research and innovation. And I noticed this bill doubles the funding for technology deployment. There's language about autonomous vehicles and really trying to promote that. Is that something you can talk about a little bit?
Well, look, these technologies they're coming, and so we have, I think, a responsibility to do as much research and understand as much as we can about how these particular technologies can be the safest, and in terms of kind of what the rollout from a federal policy needs to look like. So it's an interesting time as we think about just the technological future of transportation, and how much does transit fit in with that, autonomous vehicles fit in with that, what's the right mix of fuel sources and mix of funding sources for different methods of transportation. And so it's something that, as someone who spent 22 years, I guess, in the private sector and encouraging innovation, I think we need to make sure that we continue this commitment for funding, and I'm pleased to see it in the House bill.
Yes, great, thank you. Another question we have from our folks on the call. The bill seems to have a pretty big emphasis on fix it first. And some of our members are wondering, how does that play out in Minnesota? How does that play out in terms of certain corridors where we are hoping for a little bit of expansion? Is that something that could potentially be a barrier to certain projects in Minnesota?
Well, it could. I think that from my perspective, my biggest priority was to make sure that the buckets of money that my team added, to the language around supporting, allowed us to be able to have a good mix of, fix it, repair, and then expansion. So, for example, there's a pretty big uptick in community transportation investment grants that would help tackle projects like, the adding a lane and interchange on I-35 in Lakeville to ease traffic, as we just talked about, which of course might also lead to more conversations around bus rapid transit. In it, there is increased levels of funding that could help expedite, highway safety improvements to, 52. And so, I think there's a decent mix in this particular bill between expansion projects and fix-it projects, and certainly more funding than we've seen historically in the FAST Act.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. I guess kind of the other question, sort of overall, we're wondering if you're hearing anything about another kind of relief bill for the impacts of COVID-19 along the lines of the first three bills that we've seen that might provide some additional funding for states and local governments in general, because all of this really does have an impact on transportation. Because we know that the state of Minnesota will be dealing with a big deficit in the future, and that will make it harder, of course, to pay for everything, including transportation. So just wondering, we know the House came out with the HEROES Act, but do you see anything coming out between the House and Senate along those lines?
Yeah, certainly the House has passed a significant bill that would address the assistance needed to state and local governments. I am most concerned about the Department of Transportation and the Department of Education here in Minnesota if the federal government doesn't step up and provide the next round of packages related to COVID-19. And so, you know, as we have passed the HEROES Act, my suspicion is, just in all candor, that as we get into July and the unemployment insurance benefits expiration date starts to loom, you know, we still have over 15% of Americans at the last data point, when you look at the revision of the numbers, unemployed in this country. And so I think that will likely be the next thing that could, I'm going to say could, force the Senate and the White House to want to sit back down and negotiate. You know, when we passed the HEROES Act, most of us did it believing that it was an imperfect bill, but there was a lot of good in there for our state and local governments. In fact, I had 47 of my county commissioners and mayors in my district who signed a letter to me in support of that state and local funding, so across the political spectrum. And so I suspect that in July, you're going to start seeing potential action out of the Senate. And the number one priority for me is making sure that as part of that, we get assistance to state and local governments, because we know that all of these state DOT projects, all of our local community projects are going to be at risk if we don't provide some assistance to state and local governments. I think, again, as you look at, you know, the investment backlog for infrastructure across our nation, I mean, we're talking about almost $1 trillion already, that, you know, this is the opportunity to move forward with a bill that will help us both take away the deficiency that we're seeing and the lack of investment we've seen in our infrastructure and highways, roads, bridges, transit, and at the same time will help us address the necessary stimulus we need to put people to work in order to come out of the COVID-19 crisis in as good a shape as we can. If we don't do this, you know, we're going to be back to the trough, extending unemployment insurance benefits over and over and over again. And isn't it a better investment for this country if we can invest in the things that are going to put people to work instead of continue to extend unemployment insurance benefits while people don't have those jobs? So I just, you know, I'm optimistic. I have to, you know, I'm really proud actually that the Congress has come together now 3 times on a bipartisan basis to pass these bills. You know, the execution of some of the legislation has been less than perfect, which of course, frankly, is to be expected when you're dealing with such an inevitable crisis in such short order. But I think we have an opportunity here to really make good public policy decisions. My own perspective is I think the Federal Reserve is making some strong, brave policy decisions right now. And the Congress has to continue to do the same thing, you know, regardless of partisanship, regardless of party. I think that history is going to look back during this time frame and judge whether we were in a recession or a depression based on what the Federal Reserve and the Congress does. And so this is an opportunity as far as I see it.
Great.
Hey, Margaret and Angie, this is Will. Just a reminder about your next appointment. Sorry to kind of cut things off. I just wanted to give you a reminder about your appointment that's pending now.
Thank you, Will. I know Will gets paid to interrupt my fun, so Margaret, sorry about that.
Well, we really appreciate your time, Congresswoman Craig, and thank you so much for your work in Congress. Thank you for serving on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and we really look forward to working with you in the future on all of these issues. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity. Have a great day.
Okay,
Thank you, Representative Craig. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Margaret, and thanks everybody for participating today. We appreciate it, and looking forward to a crazy markup tomorrow.
Great. Okay, so I believe that Representative Wolgamott has joined us.
Good morning, everyone.
Oh, there he is. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, so just to make sure everyone knows, Representative Dan Wolgamott is from the St. Cloud area in the House, and he serves on the House Capital Investment Committee and the Transportation Committee. So he's our one guy that we go to. So Representative Wolgamott was the chief author of legislation providing $100 million in GO bonds for both the local road program and the local bridge program. And now we're hoping things are moving finally in terms of getting a bonding bill. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you about what you're hearing, what you're seeing, what you think will happen this week, and what we can expect.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again for the invitation to come and speak with you. I wish that we were all in person. That's always a little bit more fun. But really what I kind of wanted to do this morning was just sort of give you all kind of a broad overview of my perspective and kind of the views and priorities of my caucus, the DFL House Caucus, as far as it relates to transportation funding, and then kind of dive in a little bit into a few specific legislative agenda items. And then unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to stick around for too many questions. There's been some, unfortunately, some civil unrest in my hometown the last 2 nights that I need to be dealing with before we go into session at noon. So we'll make the most of the time we got. Sound good? Great. Well, it's no news to the people on this call that a strong multimodal transportation network is so essential to the livelihoods of Minnesotans, connecting people to places, to job opportunities, to family, to recreation. And it's really pivotal and important that our state help ensure that that network serves our residents as best as possible. And that's one of the most frustrating things that I've experienced in my first term is seeing firsthand the negative impact that it has on people's lives when we don't make investments in that network. People have to waste time stuck in traffic, costly damages to vehicles, freight shipped on deterring roads gets damaged, lack of economic investment in communities, and few options for people who don't have vehicles. Every Minnesotan deserves to be able to get to where they need to go. And so that's kind of my outlook and really what Chair Hornstein and our caucus believes. And we've tried to put our money where our mouth is. In the 2019 session, the House passed a historic bonding bill with a historic transportation package, making huge investments. Unfortunately, that got blocked in the Senate, which was really frustrating. And then in the House, during the end of the regular 2020 session, we brought a bonding bill to the floor that really tried to recognize the importance that our transportation network plays in people's lives and make according investments in roads and bridges and transit. As I'm sure many of you know, really the struggle with balancing bonding and transportation is that we certainly want strong investments through our bonding bill to help build and improve our transportation network. But the flip side of that is we don't want our investments there to be seen as a replacement for sorely needed sustainable long-term transportation funding. As you know, we need both. And so, we need to make strong and smart transportation investments and capital improvements through bonding but we can't just have short-term fixes. We need to improve the funding structures for our transportation network so we can build and maintain the network that our state and that Minnesotans need and deserve. So we've got a lot of work to do in that regard. That's kind of what gets me fired up, and why bonding and transportation were two of my top committee choices. And it's just been great to work with the Transportation Alliance and to partner together and advocate for these investments. And there's still a lot up in the air right now as far as what our bonding bill is going to look like. But we're fighting hard to make those investments, and that's obviously the biggest piece of outstanding work that's in the mix right now. And I'm really proud that the bonding bill that we passed had various levels of funding for most, if not all, of the Transportation Alliance's priorities: BRT, local roads, local bridges, wetland road replacement programs, ports, etc. But unfortunately, COVID-19 disrupted so many things this year, including the legislative session. We were able to pass a number of bipartisan transportation items to help people in this crisis. We had an extension for driver's licenses that would expire during the peacetime emergency, waivers of certain requirements so that standard licenses can be renewed online, provisions to keep kids safe when school buses deliver food or supplies, authority for MnDOT to seek federal funds to improve safety by completing the expansion of Highway 14, as well as a number of other transportation policy initiatives. So we tried the best we could to make sure that our transportation network was adapting to this historic and unprecedented pandemic. So anyway, that's a little update on what we've got. As far as what to expect this week, I think your guess is as good as mine. And if anybody on this call has a crystal ball, please send it to me, and we'll make the most of it. But so who knows? I mean, I know that the Senate came out with their bonding bill that I don't think goes far enough or makes enough of the investments that we need. I know that Chair Erdahl, or excuse me, that Representative Erdahl has been engaged in good faith with Chair Murphy on trying to put something together. I don't know what it's going to look like, but fingers crossed that they can work out a deal and we can pass a bill that makes those investments that we absolutely need. I don't know what to expect, but I do know that we're working hard, and you can rest assured that myself and the DFL House Caucus are absolutely committed to ensuring a final bonding agreement that makes the necessary investments that we need in our state's network. And we're also committed to doing what needs to be done and passing a long-term transportation funding solution. So anyway, that's what I know, and I've got time for, I guess, a couple questions. Hopefully I've got answers for you, and if not, I can certainly figure out a way to get back to Margaret or Brian. So anyway, that's where we're at.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that. And for folks on the call, again, you can type in a message in the chat bubble if you have any questions. I just wanted to give folks an update too on the Senate. Senator Jasinski was hoping to join us today, but the Senate Bonding Committee decided to take a tour of St. Paul this morning to look at some of the damage that was done through some of the unrest. So I guess the good news is they're working, they're talking. The Senate did make some changes to their original bill to address transit, for one thing, because the Senate originally didn't have any funding for transit. There's now $12 million for Metro Transit, $2 million for Greater Minnesota Transit. And the overall size of the bill has increased. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's one thing. Do you see kind of a middle ground somewhere between the House and Senate at like $1.5 billion, or is there a certain kind of overall number that you're hearing?
Not in particular. Again, I want to see, all along myself and my caucus have been advocating for a robust bonding bill. I really hate that we get hung up on these arbitrary numbers. I mean, there's needs out there, and we need to step up and be leaders and make sure that we meet those needs. As long as we're within our means and within our debt capacity. So anyway, I guess that's just sort of an aside of, it's just frustrating because I went on the tours and I, saw all summer long and into the spring that there are real needs out there. Our counties are hurting, our cities are hurting. And, as a state, we can't deficit spend, right? Only the federal government can deficit spend, but we can take advantage of our borrowing power and put Minnesotans back to work, create jobs at a time where we need it most, and make bold investments that are going to benefit our communities and our networks for decades to come. So anyway, I don't know of a magic number that's being talked about, and I just wish that we could look more at what the needs are and what we're, what Minnesota's needs are, and not get so caught up in, oh, it's got to be $1 billion, or oh, it's got to be less than $1 billion. How about we just do our jobs and fund Minnesota's transportation needs? That's my 2 cents.
Great. Thank you. We do have a question about a little different topic, but one of the things for the special session has been the distribution of the CARES Act money from the federal government to local governments. I know the small business bill seems to be moving, but do you see the bill that would distribute the CARES Act money getting passed this week?
I sure hope so. I'm not privy to any, to any. I know a lot of that is getting worked out at the chair level and at the leadership level. So I'm not privy to too many details about that, but I'll tell you that I'm certainly advocating for that. I know in St. Cloud and in Stearns County and the counties that I serve, we're hurting, and getting that funding, the sooner we can get it to them, the sooner they can start planning out what to do with it. I've been advocating that it gets, just because of the district that I serve, it's been hit hard by COVID-19. We've been one of the hot spots throughout the state, and so I wish I knew exactly when it was going to get passed. Again, if you got that crystal ball, I can leave my address in the chat box, and you can feel free to send it my way. But I'll tell you that I'm advocating that we get that money to our local governments and to our communities as soon as possible, because they really, really need it. They really need it.
Great. Okay. Well, I guess kind of, again, sort of overall big picture, it sounds like the House is interested in maybe a little longer special session than the Senate. Do you see the legislature coming back in July, or how do you have any sense from your caucus as far as like what are there things that just have to get done before the bonding bill or anything like that? Kind of big picture.
Unfortunately, I don't, nor probably does anyone have a sense of what to expect with that regard. I will tell you that I've been pretty frustrated that the Senate just right out the bat said, oh, we're going to leave on Friday no matter what. I mean, can you imagine like Minnesotans that work out in the real world, if they have a job to do, if you've got to build a house or be on a construction site, and you tell your client, nope, it doesn't matter if the house is built or if the deck is built. We're just going to kind of do what we can, and then Friday we're going to leave. No, I think that, that's not how the real world works, and that shouldn't be how the legislature works. We should, we all got elected to do a job. And so my hope is that, is that the Senate will realize that Minnesotans expect us to deliver results. And if we have to work for more than a week to deliver results, whether it's for responding to the pandemic or, responding to the systematic racism that we're seeing, and making the really important changes and reforms that we need to make with policing, or a bonding bill. We've got a lot of work to do, and to just arbitrarily shoehorn it into, only a few days. Minnesotans expect better from us, and expect us to do our jobs and get things done no matter how long it takes. So hopefully we can come together and get things done in a timely manner. But I know myself and my caucus are committed to being here in St. Paul and doing the work we need to do to deliver the results that we owe to Minnesotans.
Okay. Great. Well, you did also mention long-term transportation funding, and I also want to make sure that we don't lose sight of that. I think, as you mentioned, sometimes bonding can, people sometimes view that as a substitute. And we just want to remind everybody in the legislature that, you know, gas tax revenue, motor vehicle sales tax revenue, they're all way down because of this situation.
Right.
You know, fortunately, counties and cities receive their allocation for the year in January, but come next year, we're really worried about what's going to happen with our highway trust fund and the transit account. So do you see anything we can be doing like this fall, heading into next session, to really push the idea of a long-term funding package?
Yeah, I think just having, you know, having the local elected officials in particular, you know, and people who are coming from the local governments reaching out to their legislators. I mean, that's, you know, that's one, I think, a really powerful force to be reckoned with is, you know, nonpartisan, you know, local officials and local leaders reaching out to their legislators, you know, telling them that, look, this really shouldn't be a partisan thing. You know, and yeah, and I do. I think it was pretty shameful how having the courage to bring in new revenue got used as a political football. It just is really, I think, a disingenuous way of practicing governance. And so I think the more that you can lean on, you know, lean on those people in the communities who have those relationships that aren't necessarily partisan, but are just, you know, serving the community, whether it's local elected officials or administrators or, you know, all the above, but really just trying to change the narrative of, look, let's stop playing politics with this and let's have the guts to bring in the revenues that we're going to need to make sure that we have the world-class transportation infrastructure that Minnesota's businesses, that Minnesota's residents need to survive and thrive. So I guess just continuing to build those relationships at the local level and change that narrative, I think can be really powerful. And hopefully, you know, if we're going to change that dynamic, that's how it's going to be done. And I do hope that when we come back in 2021, that we're in a position to pass a big, bold, historic transportation bill. At least that's what I'm hoping for. That's what I'm building towards. Again, you know, January 2021 might, you know, feels like it's a decade from now, but it'll be here before we know it. And we want to be prepared, laying down the groundwork and establishing those relationships and that trust. That starts now. That starts this fall. We've got to get all hands on deck to take advantage of an opportunity that presents itself in January 2021.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for just, you know, for being an advocate for your support of the bill in 2019 and all your work on the Transportation Committee. It doesn't look like we have any other questions, so I don't want to take up more of your time.
Great. Well, thank you
so
all. Yeah, thank you so much, Margaret, and to everybody on this call, and for all the work you're doing to make sure that Minnesotans have the world-class transportation network they deserve. So I'm just really proud to be a partner with this alliance, and hopefully we have brighter future and good things in store. So thank you all very much, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, everybody on the call. We do have a recording of the call that we'll be sending out to you, and there's information on our website on the bonding bill and the House Invest in America Act, and we'll be sending out an update after the House hearing tomorrow in Washington. So stay tuned for all of our emails and information, and thank you so much for your membership in the Alliance, and thank you so much for being part of this webinar. And we hope to see you soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you.